Welcome to day 2 of Spirit Unbounded, and what an extraordinary day of speakers we have to look forward to. We hope you're also enjoying these graphics sequences made for us by Peachman Video in Germany, and the aerial introductions to each film, which were generously given to us by a talented young Christian videographer, Tom Triffitt. They don't show exactly where the speaker's sitting. We feel they express the freedom of the spirit engaged in God's world, and the often wistful hopefulness of what our speakers have to say. Our first programme is Bearing Witness to Truthfulness. An international range of speakers talk about issues of respect and freedom. Neilan D'Souza used to be the coordinator of the Young Asian Lay Leaders Forum in India, and he points to the shocking treatment of Dalits by the Catholic Church. German theologian Hille Haker interprets the natural law on which Catholic teaching is based. It is, she says, to be free to respect, protect, and help other people. And then American campaigner Jamie Manson explores Catholic notions of conscience, religious freedom, and social justice. From Latin America, 3 Catholics inspired by Bishop Oscar Romero share their thoughts on the realization of the Kingdom of God. But let's begin with Katherine Zappone, who was formerly Minister for Children and Youth in the Irish government. She proposes that the Catholic Church stops burying the voices of girls, women, and gender-fluid people and begins to embrace human rights.
I'm so delighted to be joining you, the conference on human rights in the Catholic Church. And I'd like to speak about voice, love, and freedom and how it can be a global formula for transformational change. Once upon a time, girls and young women in Ireland were incarcerated in what were called Magdalen laundries. From the 18th to the late 20th centuries, these were institutions run by Roman Catholic orders supported by the Irish state, for an estimated 30,000 fallen women. The conditions in the Magdalen laundries were brutal, enforced silence, constant surveillance, severe emotional and physical abuse, and deprivation of educational opportunity. Once upon a time, girls and young women in Ireland were incarcerated in mother and baby homes between 1922 and 1998. Again, with many of these institutions run by Roman Catholic orders supported by the Irish state. They were forcibly brought to these institutions because they were pregnant and not married. They and the children they bore were punished, ostracized, and othered. I was the government public representative in charge of finding the truth about their treatment. I was the one who announced to the world the findings of significant quantities of children's remains in what appeared to be a septic tank on the grounds of the Tuam Mother and Baby Home in County Galway. Tossed and buried in darkness, unnamed and hidden from their mothers and the world. The institutional abuse of children, girls and boys, and women at the hands of Roman Catholic orders, supported by the state, happened in other residential and medical settings, as well as the clerical abuse of children and forced removal of children from their families. Indeed, a phenomena not limited to Ireland, but happening all over the world. Having witnessed some of these experiences, having bore the state responsibility to respond with justice and love with such a history, and having a professional background of practicing theology and ethics for 2 decades, I say this. Such behaviors and practices are not an aberration of the teachings of Roman Catholicism. Rather, they are supported by it, because Roman Catholicism has excluded the voices of girls and women in the interpretation of the Bible and the teachings of Christianity. Such behavior is rooted in the burying of the voices of girls and women. Until those voices are unearthed, listened to, and heard, in order to interpret divine presence and guide moral action in our world, the Catholic Church will continue to violate girls and women, and human rights will be absent in the Catholic Church. I am reminded here by what has been voiced by two extraordinary women from different generations and nations. Adrienne Rich, the great USA poet, feminist, Wonder Woman, said once, when you have buried us, told your story, ours does not end. We stream into the unfinished, the unbegun, the possible. And Sinead O'Connor, the iconic singer-songwriter, who we are currently mourning at the untimely passing of her just this past month, quipped with great hope, they tried to bury me, but they didn't realize that I was a seed. We can all be seeds. We can all stream into the unfinished, the unbegun, the possible. And not only does this hold redemptive power for the churches and for all religions and progressive religious forces, such dynamism also lies at the root of our own becoming as girls and women and gender fluid and trans people. So, first and foremost, I want to suggest that human rights within the Catholic Church will only flourish if girls, women, gender fluid persons voice how they experience the world, who we are, what we want to be. Old-fashioned language talks about the self-determination of girls and women. Such a multiplicity of voice usually only emerges, though, if the personal, socio-political, and cultural conditions are right. As global change makers, our first job then is to make sure that those conditions are right for ourselves as well as for others. And to do this, we must begin by loving ourselves fiercely. Not an easy task, especially if familial, cultural, or religious conditions do not support this. We must acknowledge this and be really gentle with ourselves often. Yet I believe that this is integral to the challenge to be human, that we consistently seek ways to love ourselves fiercely. Every time we meet that moment, it is easier to voice who we are, to know what we desire and what we want for ourselves and our world. Every time we meet that moment, it is the beginning again of our freedom to be, to stand tall and to bring our full presence into our world. Loving ourselves fiercely is also a prime ingredient to be imago Dei. We are made in God's image, says the Catholic tradition. Other spiritual traditions also, such as Buddhism, claim that we can become God-like, or indeed become God-esque. I think that is the fullness of being human, whereby we are at the height and the depth of our power to God or to goddess in the world, to bring goodness in for ourselves, others, and of course, for the planet. To find our voice, however, in such a way that this redemptive or healing and generative or creative power is made manifest, I think that we must find ways to meld our voice into the collective voice. We must find ways at critical change junctures when a kairos appears, namely the right moment to act, to negotiate our way through our differences to find one voice looking for change. Finding this one voice requires respecting the differences of others, having empathy with their experience, and letting go of tendencies to think our way is the only way. This is what I learned in major social change movements that have brought about massive cultural change with rippling effect across the globe. When Ireland said yes to marriage equality through popular vote or popular voice, when we campaigned under the banner of Hille, which is Irish for together, to enable more reproductive rights and justice for girls, women, and pregnant people, raising our common voice made the difference. Joan Chittister says that we have to raise our common voice to be heard. I agree. We have done it. Change has come. Not easy. I can remember my fists banging on a table one evening when we were at dinner with various members of the LGBTIQ community that I did not agree with on certain matters. But somehow we managed eventually to work together as one voice with one collective or common aim. How did we do this? And how did we push it through in relation to reproductive justice as well? Well, we just talked and talked and talked, and we respected one another. We put aside the desires to be the ones with the best answers to solve the problems as we saw them. This takes leadership that is generous, relational, and good-humored. A sense of humor is a requirement for persuasive leadership, I think. How did we do this? We committed ourselves to the time frame of long. About 15 years it took to get marriage equality. From the first days, my late spouse and I started to strategize to take the Irish state to court because it would not legally recognize our life partnership. About 35 years to enable an Irish, largely Catholic vote to enable the reproductive care and freedom of girls, women, and other pregnant people in law. Yes, a lot of Catholics voted for the legal right to reproductive justice, inclusive of abortion care. A lot of Catholics voted for bodily autonomy and moral agency. Change can and does happen. While it requires a solid and confident sense of our own power, the love relational dimension of change demands at times a setting aside of our singular ambitions to create collective ambitions. And it requires that we befriend the perceived enemy at times. Those who oppose us cannot be allowed the luxury of non-dialogue with us. At times, somehow, we must find ways to their hearts. When Pope Francis came to Ireland the last time, I took an unexpected opportunity to shake his hand and to deliver this message directly to him on the steps of Aras Anukteran, which is the president's house in Ireland. Benvenuto Papa Francesco, io sono responsabile per la tua mother and baby home. Welcome, Pope Francis. I'm responsible for the tomb, mother, and baby home. Children's remains were found in a sewage system there. I hope the church will make reparation for its part in this shameful chapter. It is important. I will write you with details. Pope Francis leaned down to me and said, "Thank you for saying that." And later, when he gave a public speech in Dublin Castle, he paused at one point in his written script, and he looked out at a huge crowd and said, "I have just met the Minister for Children, and her words are still ringing in my heart." Did it change the way he thinks about women and children, about sexuality and gender? I do not know. But I hope that it has become part of the large tapestry that is being woven by so many people who are spirit unbounded or who are building counter love movements within their own churches. Big change takes a lot of time, filled with small and big words and gestures, appropriate silences, and courageous voicing when opportunities arise or when you create them. Voice, love, freedom. Do the churches create the space for these primal human features? Voice, love, and freedom characterize the change they create. 2 years ago, I conducted a piece of global research for the executive director of the UNFPA, Dr. Natalia Kanem. We were trying to figure out how to shift the very big pushback on women's rights to bodily autonomy within the United Nations discourse, negotiations, agreements, resolutions, and budgets. Nations and consultations with nations, but particularly in this instance, with her staff at regional, divisional, and country level throughout the globe confirmed that conservative religious forces are blocking the implementation of what's known as the ICPD, or the International Conference on Population and Development, which was a 1994 meeting in Cairo, where 179 governments adopted a revolutionary program of action and called for women's reproductive health and rights to take center stage in national and global development efforts. Conservative forces have built a robust, interconnected, well-resourced, and collective force. Their strategies are working. My assessment from the evidence we collected then and that piece of research was that progressive religious forces do not have similar collective strength and strategy. We need to do this. The resources are being developed. Progressive thinkers in religion are building interpretations of their sacred texts and traditions that support the moral agency, that is the free conscience of women, as seen in recent examples as Islam, Judaism, as well as Catholicism. These need to be harnessed, however, by global strategies that enable and draw on the voice, love, and freedom of all humans. Then it will come to pass that there is no more burying of the living, and human rights will be alive in the Catholic Church.
Hello everyone, warm greetings. I'm Neilan D'Souza, born and raised in a Catholic family living in Bangalore city from the state of Karnataka in the south of India. Disciple of Equals for me is an inclusive term which means to include Christian faithful of all sex, gender, class, caste, race, and region as equal followers of Jesus. Emerging church, for me, is a church which comprises of 4 key things. First of all, a church which is not a building or a structure of maintaining clerical hierarchy, but rather a gathering and a movement of people of God who are grounded in faith and all-inclusive as a disciple of equals, as well as non-discriminate in their services to people of all faith. Secondly, a church which especially works for the needs of the marginalized people all the time, and not only when it is in need or being attacked. Third, an emerging church for me is a visionary church and action-led church which participates in solving troubles and issues of the communities, at least within its surroundings. Fourth, and most importantly, a church that is free of abuse, especially sexual abuse, and also equipped and co-owned with systems that includes the laity, clergy, and the experts who play vital roles in educating, addressing, and preventing all kinds and forms of abuse propagated by and within the members of the church. The context in which I am talking is the reality which is currently taking place in India. 2023 has been a tragic year for Christians living in India. Until now, although we are only halfway through the year, there have already been over 400 reported cases of hate crimes against Christians in India, according to a recent study done by the United Christians Forum, UCF. Not to forget that nearly 250 Christian churches are being burnt in Manipur alone, and many attacked and vandalized across India over the years since 2014 after the BJP government coming into power. Secondly, the vicious and inhuman culture of discrimination and abuse lurks in the churches in India, all the way from caste discrimination to sexual abuse and discrimination. According to a document released by the Catholic Bishops Conference of India, CBCI, it says, while 12 million of 19 million members of the Catholic Church in India are Dalit Christians, only 12 of the 180 bishops are Dalits, which is itself indicates the prevalence of stark inequality and access to power being controlled by the upper caste Christians within the church in India. Apart from this, many incidents take place within the church even during festivities where Dalit Christians are not allowed to be involved during preparations or even use common space such as the parish hall for their own gatherings. I really hope all of this changes immediately now that Pope Francis has appointed Cardinal Anthony Pula, the first Dalit cardinal from India. I hope he will initiate change and put processes in place so that caste discrimination can come to an end in the Catholic Church. Sexual abuse in the church is also something that is not timely or accurately addressed in the Indian church. You might know Bishop Franco Mulakal, who was accused of raping a nun 13 times during his visits to the convent between 2014 and 16 in Kerala. He has finally resigned from his position as Bishop of Jalandhar in June 2023. Although it took 5 years, we can say that this is just a good example, but it is a shame that many more of such perpetrators still exist within the Catholic Church. I wish to see an emerging church free from all forms of discrimination and abuse.
was done with nothing but wooden nails in your scar-born hands. Oh, show me how to work in praise, trusting that I am your instrument. Oh, loving laborer, with the sweat upon your face, oh, build a table that I too may join you in the Father's place, oh, in the Father's place. The work was done with nothing but wooden nails in your scar-born hands. Oh, show me how to work in praise, trusting that I am your instrument. The kingdom's come and built upon wooden nails, pricked with joyfulness. Oh, send me out within your ways, knowing that the task is finished. The dead will rise and give you praise. Wooden nails will not hold them down. These wooden tools will break them soon and fashion them into flower beds. The curse is done, the battle won. Swords bend down into plowshares. Your scar-born hands will join with them, serving at the table you've prepared. Oh, humble carpenter,
Hello. I would like to talk a little bit about the tradition of the natural law that has in the view of some, been the greatest achievement of Christian theology and Christian moral theology in particular, and for others, it has been the greatest catastrophe or ideology that holds the Christian ethics in the grip of a pre-modern understanding. Let us see what we can do together. Imagine we would have followed the biblical tradition of a narrative ethics to remember the cross and the teachings of Jesus Christ, the hope of resurrection, and the two imperatives that we were given, namely to love God and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. Imagine we would be a community of storytellers that pour out our hearts to each other to find solace and perhaps some consolation with each other. This is not the path that the Western tradition of Christianity took, influenced so much by the Greek and the Roman tradition that had already developed an ethics and also a cosmology that Christianity had to respond to. And that is where the natural law tradition begins. I want to speak of 4 different elements of the natural law tradition and then come back to the question of how do we actually incorporate the most important, the central event of the Christian tradition, namely the becoming human of God and the life of Jesus Christ, his death by violence, and our hope of resurrection. Now, in the natural law tradition, we can begin kind of with a big narrative, who holds the world together? And many cultures, most religions begin with a certain cosmology. And the same holds true for the natural law tradition. When it refers to what it calls the eternal law, it is the order of creation that ultimately, of course, we believe is created by God. And that is important because we tell different narratives, we tell different myths of this cosmological order, but we do know that it is a narrative. The Bible knows it because it tells us the cosmological order in different stages, in different ways, in different myths and different narratives. When you turn to the Genesis story, you will be disturbed because there are 2 creation stories. If you go to Job, you get another version of a cosmological order. So by no means the natural law can say this is exactly the narrative that Christians follow. But nevertheless, the order of being is meant to give us a place where we belong. And this eternal law is closely related, and I've done that already right now with the divine law. What is meant by that is that the eternal laws are accessible for us only via the divine law, and the divine law is the revelation, God's word, that God speaks to us, to human beings, through the narratives, through the history of Israel, with their God, and the continuation of the history through Christianity and in Christian, and actually all religions' story with God. The divine law is the revelation in the Bible, but also through the tradition, through the spiritual history of human history writ large. There's a third element of the natural law that I want to focus on mostly here, and that is kind of the natural law per se, that is the anthropological and the moral dimension of the natural law. But you can see what the tradition has done is they created a hierarchy between the eternal law, the divine law, and the natural law. And this goes back kind of to Aristotle, but then also to the Stoic tradition. And there's the first complication that we are faced with, because the natural law can be read as the human nature, and we then will try to understand what is kind of what makes us human, what is the good that defines the human, what Aristotle would say. And this good is not meant in a moral way, but in a pre-moral way. It is a kind of the best functioning of our nature, our biology. So, for example, when Aristotle says human beings have language, that is the goodness of human beings. When he says human beings are political beings, that is what kind of defines human beings then. And in that respect, there is certainly an embodied element in this understanding of anthropology, but there's also, of course, the second dimension that goes beyond these biologistic or biological traits that we have to be concerned with, and language is already connected to that, and that is what makes the human being human is their reason, our capacity, our potentiality to reason. Now, in the Aristotelian understanding of human goodness in comparison to the goodness of other beings, let's say animals, plants, human beings too have a certain, almost a kind of a programming, striving towards something. So like the seed strives to become a tree or a flower, so human beings strive towards something. And Aristotle asked, and Thomas Aquinas took it up, what are human beings striving towards? And the answer is a formal answer. It is self-fulfillment. It is happiness that we are striving towards. And this happiness or self-fulfillment is not just punctual happiness or the fulfillment of desires or so, but it is a deep self-fulfillment that can only be achieved via reasoning and via self-reflection, but also by turning to something that now defines the natural law tradition in a different way, namely to turn to reason in its practical outlook. Practical reason, that is what we call morality. And it is only here in the second part of the anthropological understanding of natural law that we can ask the question, what are kind of the moral norms that drive us? Now, here I would say for the first time, we run into problems because, as you probably know, the Catholic Church often kind of merges the two, merges the understanding of biological nature as it understands it and the moral imperatives or the moral precepts that follow from that. So, for example, they say Genesis says God created, that would be divine law, human beings as man and woman, and therefore there cannot be anything in between. There cannot be intersex, although empirically we do know that, of course, there are graduations between women and men and so on, biologically speaking. And the same holds true for sexual orientation. There's not only heterosexuality, biologically speaking, but there's also homosexuality and many things in between, if you like. And so to blend the biological understanding with the moral understanding seems to me a recipe for ideological understandings of human nature. But I want to say that if we take the natural law tradition as meaning the law of reason, then another possibility emerges how we can read natural law. And it will be certainly an open understanding. It will not be just a statement once and for all, as the Bible was never meant to be read. Like, it is certainly a kind of a formal understanding of what human reason means, namely to reflect upon our lives, about ourselves, to deliberate how we can live together. And it is here exactly that the teachings of the Bible center those who are on the margins, for example. Be a neighbor to those who appear not to belong. or search for the goodness of other people rather than being suspicious of others. Create an order where everyone is fed. Create an order that is just, where the workers who begin to work in the middle of the day are still being paid at the end of the day, because they too need to bring home some of their earnings. So that is the biblical teaching that we could use with a human reason, with a human law. And I would say that here the two principles of justice and love come into play, and they are open concepts. And I very much like two understandings that I take from Hannah Arendt. So the one is the capacity of human beings, the freedom to be free. And that seems to me an understanding of the law of reason that we need to take very, very seriously. Kant would have formulated as autonomy, the freedom to give yourself the norms by which you then want to live and need to live. And if you use your reason, you will understand that you have to respect other people, that you have to protect them, and that you have to help them, provide them with the means so that they too can live a self-fulfilled life. And that was already what I just did, formulation of the three groups of human rights. The second statement by Hannah Arendt that I want to take up here is there's only one right that actually really matters, and that is the right to have rights. And that seems to me also a formulation that I can make compatible with the natural law tradition if it is understood as the law of reason. The right to have rights means nothing else than taking seriously the human dignity of every other human being. Now, there is a fourth level. I've begun with a cosmological order that can be questioned and be retold in different ways. There's the divine law that we tie to Revelation as it is revealed in scripture and tradition, and we're discerning that every one of us throughout history. Then there's the anthropological dimension of the natural law that includes the moral dimension of reason. And the fourth level that I want to quickly address here is the positive law. And the natural law, standing on the shoulders, if you like, of scripture and tradition on the one hand side, but also kind of connected to the cosmological order where human beings are only, need to be humble, are only a small part within the great ecology of being, if you like. Positive laws are the laws that we then give ourselves as nation states, and the assumption is that the natural law, the law of reason, needs to guide these positive laws. If I formulate it this way, there's no problem really. We want the law to follow love and justice. We call it in the legal understanding justice, of course, but love turns into mercy, and sometimes also into epikeia, as it was called, the kind of bending of the law for the good of the people who are being judged. Okay, so that suffering is not be added to suffering already, but the justice is meant to do justice to the victims and the perpetrators, but not in an unproportional way. Let's put it that way. But I want to end again with a question of where I started. What would it mean to center our moral theology on the incarnation of God becoming human, on the life of Jesus, the cross, the crucifixion, in a violent act, the death in a violent act, and our hope for resurrection that ultimately will mean the hope in the coming of the kingdom of God. I believe that the natural law, as it has been traditionally used and is still used in the teachings of the Catholic Church, needs to be put on pause here, and we should rather speak of the human rights. The International Theological Commission has begun the work in 2009 to speak of universal rights rather than the natural law per se, but they didn't go far enough. I think that we should actually really embrace the human rights tradition and also acknowledge that we tell stories as Christians too, that we have a story to tell, that we have a story to remember, that our cosmological understanding is an understanding of humility of human beings, the effort to create the conditions so that we can work together to reduce the threats to the whole creation right now. I believe that the question of faith and reason is always in play when we begin to reflect upon our theology, our Christianity, our legacy, and so on. And each generation perhaps has to begin this reflection on faith and reason on its own again. I believe that with the help of the tradition of the natural law, we can understand that theology's task is always to critique the factual injustices, that there is from our tradition the possibility to find some meaningfulness in our own existence, in our time, in our present time. I believe that the Christian tradition motivates us to struggle for more justice, struggle for liberation towards justice, as I call it. And I do believe that the Christian tradition gives us the hope to have hope. Hope against hope, Paul said. But one of the philosophers that I adore, Walter Benjamin, has said it: we have hope for those who have no hope. And I believe that is a reminder why Christians cannot give up, must not give up. But it also means that we have to critique and question the tradition when it itself becomes an instrument of power and an instrument of violence. And I believe that especially the positive law of the church, the canon law, is outdated, and it should actually be radically reformed so that the lay people are included in a new founding, so that we all can become the founding fathers and mothers of the Constitution of the Church for the 21st century. That is my hope, against hope perhaps, but also my faith and my belief that we can do it. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody, it's Jamie Manson, President of Catholics for Choice, with another video offering for you. This one is about how to use church teaching to fight against church teaching. I created this video originally to make arguments in support of abortion rights. But watching the video again, it struck me that you could actually use these arguments in a number of contexts, including same-sex marriage, the right to contraception, trans rights, all of these issues where church teaching is creating profound injustice, both within the church and in society with their enormous political influence and legal influence. We can use the church's understanding of conscience, of religious freedom, and of social justice to struggle back against the church and these very unjust teachings. So I hope it's helpful to you, and see you on the other side. So let's start with conscience. Here's a fun fact about the origins of the word conscience. It's first mentioned in the play Antigone by Sophocles. And Antigone, a woman, is faced with a choice between obeying a royal command to keep her brother unburied or flouting the king's authority. And Antigone, as Sophocles writes it, hears an inner voice compelling her to rebel and does what she considers the right thing to do after careful deliberation. And that's the first time we know in the West that we heard about conscience. And I think it's really interesting that it's a woman flouting hegemonic rule. So in terms of the roots of the word, in Greek, it's synodesis, which means knowledge of oneself. That's the word for conscience. In Latin, it's conscientia, which means an attempt to be true to one's highest ideals. We mentioned last week that conscience is mentioned 30 times in the New Testament. You know what's never mentioned in the New Testament? The word abortion. Augustine mentions it 900 times in his writings. He calling it a substitute for the law. And Aquinas, of all the Catholic theologians of medieval times, probably wrote about it the most. And he said, he addressed it particularly when conscience conflicts with law. That's those questions that are around, what do I do when my conscience conflicts with the law? He tried to address those questions. So he said that conscience could never be wrong, though it can be impeded, though he doesn't say much about what he means by that. But he does say that acting against one's conscience is always a sin, because to act against your conscience means to second guess your own human capacity for freedom of choice. And to do that, to second guess that, will be to deny, in a sense, your own human dignity as a creation of God. So he had very strong feelings about the importance of what we call the primacy of conscience, that it should be the final arbiter in all moral decision making. And the Catholic Church agrees, which I'll talk about in a minute. How does our conscience gets formed? Whenever we're deliberating among possible courses of action, we are always, by definition, using our conscience. We're using our conscience every day of our life from when we are young. We exercise it in our experiences, our relationships, our cultural norms, institutional policies. Depending on how much relative social power we have, we are constantly exercising our conscience in these circumstances. Our conscience gets formed through prayer, education, our own personal reflection, and being in community with others. It is not, believe it or not, formed by reading bishops' documents, much as they believe that it's true. Now, what does the Catholic Church have to say about conscience? Well, it's it's basically a paraphrase of Thomas Aquinas. Here's a direct quote from paragraph 1778. The Church says, "Conscience is a judgment of reason whereby the human person recognizes the moral quality of a concrete act that they are going to perform, are in the process of performing, or have already completed. In all they say and do, the human person is obliged to follow faithfully what they know to be just and right." And so the two most important pieces, I think, of this teaching in the Catechism are that judgments of conscience are based in human reason. That's a gift that God gives us. And that you should always follow your conscience. Now, this is a part of the church teaching that always frustrates, conservative Catholics and conservative members of the hierarchy. But here it is. And it's truly Catholic because we have this understanding that God gave us reason. Catholics have an ability to see gray areas in a way I think evangelicals don't. Because of our understandings of grace, because of understandings of conscience, because of our understandings of human reason, the way in which we take not just the Bible for our sources of theological wisdom, but life experience, the sciences, the arts. There's so many sources that we draw upon to achieve theological truth and theological wisdom. Conscience and freedom. So in the Catholic tradition, conscience is a link between that human reason, that rationality, and human freedom. This idea of human freedom was sort of rediscovered in Vatican II after being long put away and being dormant, probably for centuries. Vatican II teaches on the dignity of the human person and the freedom of each person to choose their own religion or to choose no religion. Vatican II had some breathtaking teachings on religious freedom, which are now being roundly ignored by the bishops, who are constantly in the Supreme Court trying to take away basic human civil rights on religious freedom claims. But the truth is that that guarantee of religious freedom, in the way in which our Constitution understands it, and even the way in which our church teaching understands it, is freedom of religion means freedom of religion, meaning you can practice your religion. You have that freedom in this country, but you also have the right to be free from religion. And that's really what we are seeing happening, is just this erosion of the ability of this country to separate church and state. And a lot of it because of the influence of the church on politics, on legislation, and in the courts. And so to do that, to start to blur those lines, is not only to go against the teachings of our Constitution, but it's also against the teachings of Vatican II, which had some very rich ideas about religious freedom. The Jesuit John Courtney Murray did some wonderful work on that. More recently, another Jesuit, David Hollenbach, has done some great work on religious freedom, which I invite you to take a look at. The most important thing, I think, is that Catholics get this. 73% of them say that when they are answering difficult moral questions, they rely on their conscience a great deal. They do not rely on the teachings of bishops a great deal. So let's go through quickly and look at the Catholic social justice tradition and where these two frameworks intersect. Both Catholic social justice and reproductive justice call us to consider the whole person in issues of policy and morality. They look at people through the totality of their lived experience. These are the two things that these frameworks absolutely agree on. And we think at Catholics for Choice, as we reflect on this more and more, that reproductive justice can be a social justice value. Why? Because it centers the most marginalized people in our society, which is the hallmark of our Catholic social justice teaching. And it is fundamentally founded on the belief that all people deserve access to economic, social, and political resources to make decisions about their families and their family planning. So let's just take a very quick look at the 7 principles of Catholic social teaching and how they intersect with reproductive justice. The first one is the call to family, community, and participation in the common good. So we as Catholics have this belief that every person has the distinct right to participate in family and community and pursue the common good. If we cannot build a society where all people can thrive together, justice cannot be achieved. That is pure Catholic, pure RJ. The call to community and participation in pursuit of the common good means building a voice where all societies are heard. This is a perfect parallel between these two frameworks. Catholics believe in rights and responsibilities as part of our social justice framework, that right to access all fundamental things required to lead a dignified life: food, water, shelter, and health care. Reproductive justice would say the decision to have children is deeply impacted by all life circumstances. So it's really about building up human dignity. So again, we have this notion of that we are entitled to these fundamental things to lead a dignified life. So, of course, everyone knows about our preferential option for the poor and the vulnerable. We prioritize people who are in poverty, sick, subjected to situations of powerlessness, or marginalized by governments and social systems. This is really, really the hallmark of our belief. And I think that it's something that is absolutely true of reproductive justice, too. Reproductive justice would say 75%, remind you, 75% of abortion patients are low income and 50% are below the federal poverty line. So to focus on their access to care would be absolutely showing a preferential option for them. Our work must improve reproductive health care overall, and it must and can't further stigmatize people who choose abortion, especially those who are in poverty. Dignity of work and the rights of workers. We have to work for better conditions. This is something where RJ would absolutely agree. We have a moral obligation to provide comprehensive health care, paid parental leave, and free childcare. These are the basic social structures that need to be in place to be able to raise a child in a healthy environment.
Solidarity, it's a radical commitment to bearing the burdens of those who are suffering. Abortion bans and restrictions cause disproportionate suffering. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit, to those who are already oppressed by systemic injustices of gender, racial, and economic inequality. So whenever these bans are put in place, it's not necessarily white wealthy people who are affected. You know, they have money, they can travel, they can get to another state where you can get access to abortion. It's always the poor that disproportionately suffer over these ideological battles about abortion. And the last Catholic social justice value is care for our common home, which recognizes the inherent connection between all living beings. We seek to put ourselves in right relationship with the land, which means protecting the earth from the existential threat of climate change. And this notion of environmental justice is really important to the reproductive justice framework as well. You have to have environmental justice is essential to ensuring people can parent children in safe and sustainable communities. So I hope you can see those really rich parallels between the two frameworks.
So there it is, 12 cool minutes on the Church's teaching on conscience, religious freedom, and social justice. Again, I did present this in a context of support for the right to abortion access, but I think they can be used in all sorts of spheres where Catholic teaching, particularly about sexuality, is deeply unjust, which is just about all of the teachings, if we're being honest. So I hope it's helpful to you. I think one of the most powerful ways that we can argue back with the Catholic Church is to use the deepest elements of our tradition. And that's what we try to do at Catholics for Choice. And I would encourage you to do the same in whatever your particular issue is, your quest for justice within our church. Thanks so much for your attention, and I look forward to being with you live in October, where I'll be giving a talk on the relationship between women's equality and abortion rights. These are two issues that are largely missing from the Synod documents, so we're going to raise them up there, and I am grateful for the opportunity, and I hope to see you then. Thank you so much.
This is the contribution of the International Christian Network in solidarity with the peoples of Latin America, XVI, and the global network Convida 20, for the event Human Rights in the Catholic Church, the Discipleship of Equals.
Discipulado de iguales.
The topic of human rights in the church is of utmost importance. In our organizations, XVI and Convida 20, represented in 21 countries, we approach this issue in various ways. Human rights is a concept deeply rooted in the Old Testament, starting from Genesis. We are created in the image and likeness of God. And from there, we acknowledge that the fundamental dignity of every human being must be respected. Sulman, Hincapié, Riojas is co-secretary of XVI Colombia. How do you see Jesus' position on the issue of human rights?
Jesus welcomed, attended to, healed and forgave people from all social strata, even challenging the religious authorities. He didn't reject or excommunicate anyone. He healed a leper considered unclean, Mark 1:40-45. Called Matthew a publican and tax collector. Engaged in a conversation with a Samaritan woman, which was forbidden at the time, John 4:1-26. And he showed respect for the dignity of a prostitute, Luke 7:36-50, among many other instances. The New Testament consistently reaffirms that God does not show favoritism. Galatians 2:6, Acts 10:34, Romans 2:11, Ephesians 6:9.
También, a lo largo de la historia de la Iglesia,
throughout the history of the Church, notable individuals have championed the defense of human rights.
mejor dicho, un importante trabajo en defensa de los derechos humanos. Maricarmen Montes,
Montes, member of the Governing Council of XVI, Mexico, I believe you prepared a brief summary of these influential figures.
Building upon the biblical foundation of human rights, history also reveals individuals and teachings that, although not explicitly using the term, advocated for the rights of individuals and condemned abuses. Some noteworthy figures include Cyril of Jerusalem, John Chrysostom, Ambrose of Milan. Subsequently, theology spoke more of a treatise on morals, on the virtue of justice, on charity. It was only with Pope Leo XIII's publication of the encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891 that a new era in the treatment of human and social rights began.
But the history of the Church has also witnessed regrettable moments during which the Church itself violated human rights. Some famous instances include the Iron Century of the Papacy, marked by a decline in the Church centred in Rome with more than 40 successive popes and anti-popes from the 9th to the 11th centuries. The Crusades. The rejection of the proposals of the Reformers during and after Martin Luther's time, known as the Protestant Reformation. The Wars of Religion, 1562 and 1598. The Inquisition, which lasted from the 12th to the 19th centuries. The European invasion, forced evangelization, and the errors committed against the native peoples from 1492 to 1821, for which popes have sought forgiveness. John Paul II did so in 1992, Benedict in 2007, and Pope Francis in 2015, 2016, and 2021. The Syllabus, a pontifical document listing modern religious errors condemned respectively by Pius IX and Pius X. The complicity of some church hierarchs and institutions in persecuting, even assassinating, socio-political activists, especially those who profess Marxism and were accused of being communists, from 1950 to 2000. As people identified with the Church, we have to confront these historical aspects honestly. Although some progress has been made in the Church regarding the recognition and respect of human rights, there is still much work to be done. We commend various declarations by Pope Francis, including his efforts to declericalize the Church, to promote lay mission, and to integrate women into ecclesiastical structures.
We consider the acceptance of women to the ministerial priesthood to be important, as we believe that there are not sufficient theological reasons to deny them this right. Following the principles of God doesn't show favoritism and the example of Jesus, who embraced and welcomed all, we must advance in accepting transgender people belonging to the LGBTIQ community. As a church, we must strive to eliminate prejudices and inclusively support and respect them. They must be welcomed with respect, compassion, and gentleness. In their regard, every sign of unjust discrimination is to be avoided. As Catechism 2258 says,
Valoramos también la expresión del Papa Francisco.
We also commend Pope Francis's statement, "If a person is gay and seeks God and has goodwill, who am I to judge him?" on returning from Brazil in July 2013. The historical conceptions of God and how we relate to him have paradoxically divided us, leading to conflicts and wars. Often disregarding the human rights of all God's children. Therefore, we believe that the defense and promotion of these rights should be pursued ecumenically to overcome the scandal of division and fulfilling the Lord's dream that they may all be one and the world may believe. We aspire to be a church that courageously denounces aggression against human rights in society. Following the example of Archbishop Romero, our great inspiration, he said in March 1980, "The Church, defender of the rights of God, of the law of God, of human dignity, of the person, cannot remain silent in the face of so much abomination." Together with Archbishop Romero, we want to be a church that's also willing to be denounced, as Archbishop Romero said to the clergy in November 1978. The first sin of the church is when there is a contradiction between what's taught and what is done. Brothers, in March last year, in an official communiqué, we bishops wrote this: "Anyone who denounces must be ready to be denounced." And it's our turn this Sunday. Today, in a community reflection, with all frankness, I'm inviting everyone who are the prophetic people, who have the obligation to denounce the injustices of the world, that we look at ourselves, from the pastors to the faithful, to see if our denunciation is not going to be a hypocrisy. We say, but we do not do. We continue to pray with Pope Francis, who in April 2021 proposed that we pray for those who defend human rights, saying defending fundamental human rights takes courage and determination. This is the contribution of the International Christian Network in solidarity with the peoples of Latin America, SIXAL, and the global network Convida 20, for the event Human Rights in the Catholic Church, the Discipleship of Equals.